The lesson slides for topic 21.1 food supply. This is an extra resource for you. Mrs. Bocelli has already posted the work and some textbook pages and so on for you to do, as well as past paper questions. And you'll notice on Manage Back I've also put a video on famine for you. So this is just extra resources for you if you wanted to go through the lesson slides as if I was standing up in front of you at the start of the class. So take your books, take your papers, take your markers and get ready to take some notes. You should also be taking notes from the textbook pages that Mrs. Bocelli posted for you. Okay, your learning objectives. Obviously this is straight from your syllabus and you should always have your syllabus in front of you when we're going through a new topic. You need to be able to state how modern technology has resulted in increased food production in terms of agricultural machinery to use larger areas of land and to improve efficiency, chemical fertilisers to improve yields, insecticides to improve quality and yield, herbicides to reduce competition with weeds, and selective breeding to improve production by crop plants and livestock, for example, cattle, fish, poultry, and so on. You need to be able to describe the negative impacts to an ecosystem of large-scale monocultures of crop plants. You need to be able to describe the negative impacts to an ecosystem of intensive livestock production. Now, they're all the core points from the syllabus. So any of you who are just doing core, you can stop here. Those of you who are doing core and supplement, you also need to be able to discuss the social, environmental and economic implications of providing sufficient food for an increasing human global population. You need to be able to discuss the problems which contribute to famine, including unequal distribution of food, drought and flooding, increasing population and poverty. Okay, so agricultural machinery was introduced basically just after World War II. And before that, we didn't have massive conglomerate farms. We just had small local farmers producing and supplying to local sellers. After World War II, they had an economic rollout, particularly in North America, where they wanted to increase their food supply. So one of the things that they introduced was a lot of large machinery. And what this did was it made the farmers be able to cultivate much larger areas of land and therefore produce crops en masse and in industrial quantities. What also happened was a lot of small farms were bought up by the big companies. And instead of having to have people working in the fields, they could do twice as much, twice as fast with their machinery. So it increased their yield massively. The use of fertilisers, well, you know from your plants topic for mineral requirements of plants that they need nitrogen and magnesium. When you farm a crop, you are interrupting the nitrogen cycle because instead of any dead plant matter returning to the soil and then going through the process of decomposition and ammonification and nitrification and then returning the nutrients to the soil properly, they remove the plants. So any nitrogen and magnesium that were in those plants that the plants had absorbed from the soil are being removed from that ecosystem. So what would happen over time is that the crop production would get less and less as the soil became less and less fertile and had fewer nutrients. Now in the Middle Ages, you would remember from way back in Key Stage 3 history and geography that they knew about this, and so they did rotational cropping, where they had like your corn or your grain or so on, and then they would have a rotation where they would plant legumes because they have the root nodules with the nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they would also have a season where each field would be fallow. Now, modern farming techniques don't want to do that, so to make up for being able to do that, they put a lot of fertiliser in the soil. This increases yield because you increase the availability of nitrogen in the soil, plus magnesium, plus also phosphorus. If you look at your general average fertiliser, it's NPK, so it has phosphorus as well, which is really good for fruiting and flowering. As you know, without these nutrients, you'll get reduced plant growth. A problem with fertilisers that we'll get to later in this Unit 21 is that they can interrupt the nitrogen cycle so much that you get excess nitrogen leaching into bodies of water, and you can have a problem with something called eutrophication. However, when used correctly, nitrogen fertiliser has been very successful in increasing yields and crops. The use of pesticides, in the old days, again, either farmers would have to go through and pick off grubs and so on, or you would let your chickens go through your vegetable crop. So your small-scale farmer or your backyard farmer or your subsistence farmer, they would have lots of different crops growing all at the same time, and they would let their chickens and often also their goats run through the crops. And particularly the chickens, they would pick up any bugs and they would eat any grubs and bugs that were on the plants and the crops and the fruit. And that was a natural way of managing pests. They don't do that anymore, again, because we're looking at large agriculture, industrial scale agriculture. So now what they do is they use pesticides. And what this does is it can wipe out any bugs, pests, insects and so on that are attacking that particular crop. Again, there's downsides to that. One of the things is when you have massive agriculture, they generally only plant one crop at a time. So you would have, say for example, an entire field of corn. And if there's a bug or a beetle or an insect that particularly likes to eat corn, if that bug got into the crop, you could lose the entire field or the entire farm. So the farmers really have to use a lot of pesticides to prevent this happening with their modern farming methods. The pesticides are on the crops, and you know from your genetics topic that they can also do GMO, and they can put the pesticides into the DNA of the crops so that the crop is actually producing pesticide in the tissues of the plant, and that will actually kill any bugs or beetles. The use of herbicides, and you know this as well from the plants unit when we were looking at auxins and plant hormones as a use of plant hormones for herbicides. The weed plants are usually broad-leafed plants, so they spray the herbicides onto the crop. The broad-leafed plants absorb a much higher dose of the herbicide, and what this does is it kills them, and then the weeds aren't taking up nutrients from the soil that the farmers want the crop plants to take up. So this is also something that they use to increase food production. Artificial selection, you know about artificial selection. There's a guy called Norman Borlaug who was one of the pioneers of artificial selection in crop plants, and he led what was known as the Green Revolution first in Mexico. They had a lot of problems with their crops not being able to keep up with the needs of the people. And so Norman Borlaug actually came in and introduced artificial selection as a way of increasing yield, introducing drought-resistant crops, introducing crops that were far more tolerant to the growing conditions in Mexico, and his work did really, really, really well. And then he took these methods and took them to India and Africa and lots of other countries. There was a problem with a particular disease in the crops in Mexico called rust, and he bred corn and maize that were particularly, and wheat that were particularly resistant to the rust disease. Now, this isn't GMO, it's selective artificial breeding, but it has been extremely successful, and our plants and animals have gone a long way from the original plants and animals, and you'll remember that from the previous topic before. But this is also a really significant method of increased food production. The monoculture crops, we have the main problems with the monoculture crops is decreased biodiversity. And the thing is with your biodiversity is you need your insects and your different kinds of flowers and weeds and so on to actually increase the health of the soil and increase the health of the actual ecosystem itself. So if I've got less insects, I've got less pollinators. If I've got less pollinators, I have less vegetables, and I also have less pollinators for the surrounding areas. It's known that in America they actually import bees from Australia, and they use them to pollinate their almond crop, for an example. Less soil organisms, your insecticides are killing off your soil organisms. And the problem with the monoculture crop is that if you do get a beetle or a bug or an insect that specifically likes that kind of crop, you can lose the whole crop from just one particular species of insect. So they are more prone to invasion by pests. They're more prone to disease, because if I've got a large genetic variety in my crop that I'm growing, and some of them are susceptible and some of them are resistant to a particular plant disease, then yes, I might lose some of my crop, but I'm going to keep most of it. And then I would breed the next generation would actually be resistant to this particular disease. However, if I've got a monoculture crop that is possibly cloned, I could end up losing the whole crop very, very easily from one disease or one pest. Therefore, I need a lot more chemicals, I need a lot more herbicides, pesticides and fertilizers to make up for all of these problems. You just have a massive impact on the local ecosystem when you plant monoculture crops, because any of the local organisms, small mammals, insects and so on, birds and so on, they just leave because they don't have enough variety to support themselves. Intensive livestock production is another massive ecological impacting method of food production. There's a huge amount of waste. So if you look at the picture on the slide, and this is a pig farm, firstly, well, you can see all the sows, the female pigs, they're just being kept in this cage, lying on their side with the babies sucking on them, and that's their life. They're packed in really tightly, so if one of them gets a disease, then the chances are they're all going to get sick because of the high densities, like going to Maca or to Red Sea Mall. So what they do is they give them lots and lots of antibiotics. One of the things that the antibiotics do is, for some reason, it actually increases the growth and the size of the animal, and that's most likely because it takes away the need for the animal to be expending energy on fighting bacteria and so on. However, you're increasing the opportunity for antibiotic-resistant bacteria to get into the livestock. They have a large amount of waste to pollute, produced. You can imagine looking at this pig farm, how much pig poo they would be producing, and then generally what they would do, you can see the concrete floor, they would hose out. So the animals are still there, and they hose out the whole place, and then they've got a drain, and the watered out pig poo will go into some kind of a pond or a lake. And this is basically a sewage lake, which is a massive source of pollution and a massive source of nutrifying or too much nutrients in the groundwater, which can also cause problems because the bacteria can get into the groundwater and the excess nutrients can get into rivers and other lakes and so on. They also use hormones to increase the yield, and these hormones have been known to get into humans. Most people have heard about the estrogens that they give chickens to make them grow bigger and have much more breast meat. And what has happened in some countries and some communities is that men, particularly young men who eat lots of chicken that's had hormone treatment, get man boobs, which is not very fun for the young men who have to suffer that. The animals are also given artificial feeding, and it's all just, it's not fun to look at and it's not fun to think about, but this is actually the reality of most of our meat production at the moment. The other thing that happens is when they go to be slaughtered, they're all crowded up together, so the animals are getting poo on them and they're getting squashed up together and they're sharing each other's bacteria and so on. So that's another reason why they use massive amounts of antibiotics. And you see on the slide here, 80% of antibiotics in the US are fed to animals in factory farms. So this is a massive, massive impact. World food supply, there's not necessarily a problem with the amount of food we produce in the world. The problem that we have is equal distribution. Our unequal food distribution, if we distributed all the resources that we currently make, we would have enough calories for every single human on the planet to have sufficient protein and carbohydrates and vegetables and calories to be healthy. The difference is that most of the food production is in countries that have high wealth and less population density. And the countries who need more food are not necessarily the countries where people are living close to or on arable or farmable land. And then there are also the countries who can't necessarily easily afford imports. Our other main problem that we have is food wastage in the West. Our very rich diet of wanting to have too much food in the house is causing massive amounts of food wastage, which makes the overall world population think that we need to produce more food in order to feed the growing world population. Well, we don't. We just need to stop wasting it, and we need to make it more available and more evenly distributed. Obviously, climate change is going to have an impact on world food supply because areas of drought and marginal lands, which is lands close to deserts that are at risk of becoming desertified themselves, are going to increase. Rainfall is going to change. Deserts are going to get bigger. Floods are going to happen more often. Environmental and economic implications are that basically the World Food Bank is struggling a lot, and that the rich countries are wasting food and the poor countries are begging for food. Basically, that's our problem that we have with world food supply, and there's massive implications for this. Okay, the problems that contribute to famine. We've got unequal food distribution, which I just discussed. So, for example, in countries like Somalia, Yemen, Ethiopia, Eritrea, that have been known to have massive famines, It's because these countries have had a drought and they've been unable to produce enough food, and they've been unable to access food aid. So we've got the people in the developed countries who have too much food, and the people in the undeveloped countries who have not enough food. And as I said before, the problem is that there's enough food being produced to feed everybody. And you also know from topic 19 with your food chains is if the people in the developed countries and the rich part of the world stopped eating quite so much meat, there would be far more energy available in the food production, food chain and energy systems for us to more than feed everybody on the planet. Climate change and global warming has changed the pattern and will continue to change the pattern of rainfall. Everybody's heard about the fires in Australia. They followed on from a few years of drought, but also now we've had the rainfall, and now we've got areas of massive flooding. So another thing that happens with monoculture cropping is that we get a lot of deforestation, and that increases flooding because the water can't get soaked into the soil properly. So also because of change in rainfall distribution, you have flooding, and that can destroy crops. You can lose entire year's worth of crops because of floods. Same results but opposite reason is your drought. And again, this is seasonal, cyclical, it's been going on forever, but tends to hit a lot harder in places in the world such as Somalia, for example, Yemen, Eritrea. Syria had a huge drought before their war started, and that was one of the things that actually contributed to the civil unrest in Syria. Increasing population and lack of population control will increase the potential for famine, but war and conflict is actually probably the worst part of that, because if you have flooding, if you have drought, if you have unequal food distribution, the World Food Bank and the World Health Organization, they will get on top of the idea and they will try and send food to that country. However, if they can't get in because of local conflict, they can't supply the food to the people, which again is what happened in Somalia as an example. There was a huge, terrible civil war. The people were starving because they couldn't get the food in. The people were who would normally be farming were fighting. Instead, there was a drought which increased the severity of the conflict, and the people in charge of the food aid were unable to get that food into the people because it was too dangerous for them to go into most of the areas. Yemen has had the same problem because of medicine and food and so on, that the problem is because of the conflict is the main reason why they're having famine in Yemen now. So guys, you should have made notes about all of these things, and if you want to ask questions of either myself or Mrs. Pacelli, then use the comment section on the bottom of this post for the work. Okay, and we'll post something else next week. Next week we'll be doing habitat destruction. Okay, see you later. Bye-bye.